Our topic today is a pressing one. It is the issue of marriage. And to help unpack that a bit, I'm so thrilled to introduce to you a Dominican father, Gregory Pine. He's at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, right across from CU's campus. And he ventured all the way out here. So please let's give a warm welcome to Father Pine.
Okay. As Susan said, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, which is this particular region. I'm originally from outside of Philadelphia, so if you have a spare prayer at 4:40, I'd appreciate that. That'll actually be while I'm talking. Maybe we could take a moment of silence to think about them Philadelphia Eagles. I went to the Franciscan University of Steubenville. I graduated in 2010, upon which I entered the Order of Preachers. I was ordained a priest 2.5 years ago. I was assigned for a time as a parish priest in Louisville, Kentucky, and I also taught at Bellarmine University, which is a Catholic school in town. And then I was just recently reassigned back here to Washington, D.C., where I work for the Thomistic Institute. The Thomistic Institute is a research institute of our seminary faculty, and originally it began as a program whereby we kind of hosted conferences and worked to vigorously promote thought within the Catholic intellectual tradition. But then about 3.5 years ago, we had the idea to begin on college campuses chapters of the Thomistic Institute. So students can organize and establish a chapter of the Thomistic Institute, and then they can have top-notch speakers. Catholic intellectuals come and give lectures on a variety of topics, so they can bring their particular competencies of cultural anthropology or evolutionary biology or whatever to, like in dialogue with people speaking from within the Catholic intellectual tradition on matters of philosophy and theology and etc. And we found it just to be very, very fruitful. So it's been the source of many conversions. It's been the source of a great kind of network of solidarity among people who might otherwise feel alone at big secular campuses. So it's been a great grace to participate in the work of the Institute for the past few months. So we're going to talk tonight about matrimony. So let's begin with a little image. Let's say that, tomorrow, for whatever reason, you feel moved to go to a movie. Okay. Where I was last assigned in Louisville, there was this old theater called the Louisville Palace, and they used to put up kind of like reruns, I suppose, of Hitchcock movies, and they were like $2 to get in, which is great. So let's say that North by Northwest is going on at a local theater. Let's say it starts at 6:45. So you do what any sensible person does, and you go to Chick-fil-A on the way. And you pick up a spicy chicken deluxe with pepper jack cheese and no pickles. You get a medium-sized waffle fry with 2 Chick-fil-A sauces, and you get a large peppermint chocolate chip shake, because it's still Christmas time at Chick-fil-A, right? But then something tragic happens. Your phone rings, and you have a family emergency, okay? So like ADT calls you, they're like, your alarm's going off, and no one's at home, and you're like, yikes. And then you go back and you find out that someone just left a pot of water on the stove, it burned off, and then it was smoking. Tragic. Nobody's hurt, thanks be to God. But then you're like, movie. So you still try to get there, but let's say you arrive 20 minutes late. And you're watching, you're like, man, I can't quite remember how this began. It's been a while. Cary Grant's looking great, as always, just killing it out there. But because of the stress of the ADT situation, let's say that you forget to silence your cell phone, okay? And about like an hour in, you get a text message, and because we are trained to look at our phone anytime it vibrates, you're just like, you dart towards it. And as a result, you find out that there is a further family emergency. So like, let's say somebody's back at home doing homework. Maybe it's like your high school senior, he's in Calc AB, he just got to integrals and it's blowing his mind. And he's having a meltdown. You're like, okay, I'm coming. Right, so you miss the end of the movie. So then let's say you get back home and your husband or wife says, how was the movie? To which you respond, I don't know. It's really hard to say. Well, like how do you evaluate a movie for which you weren't present at both beginning and end? Now, silly example, but I would put it to you that is actually the situation of our lives. That is the situation of our lives, speaking theologically, right? We are a kind of narrative being, and we attempt to make sense of our lives as a kind of story. But the problem is, our origins are obscured from us. We do not know what it was like to live as God originally intended, because sin obscures that fact and alienates us from our deepest identity. But we also do not know what the end holds. 1 Corinthians 2:9, eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, nor has it so much as dawned on the heart of man what God has in store for those who love him. So we are living our lives, unfolding the narrative of this human drama, but we don't really know what the beginning is, and we don't really know what the end is. The good news is that Christ gives us not only himself, his person, and his grace, but he also tells the story of redemption in each one of us individually. So Christianity is not like a ethical choice or a lofty ideal. It's an event, an encounter with a person who imparts to life a new horizon and a decisive direction, such that his story told in me makes sense of the whole, and I can look back on it and know why. I can call each thing by its right name. So, in order to make sense of marriage, Christ does something revolutionary. He reminds us of our beginning. So we read from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" He said to them, "For your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery." So Christ, when explaining the nature of marriage, appeals to the beginning. Here, in its context, there were like two schools of thought on the matter. Some people thought that you could divorce your wife for any cause whatsoever, and some thought that you had to have kind of proof of infidelity. So they're saying, which school do you pertain to? And he says neither, because from the beginning, God intended that they be joined together in such a way that they never depart, but for the death of one of the spouses. So, what we're talking about then is God's plan for marriage as originally intended, as redeemed in Christ, and as tending towards heaven. Because ultimately that's the goal. If it doesn't help us get towards heaven, then it's so much nonsense, right? So we believe that marriage was intended from the beginning. So it's part of God's plan for our sanctification. In the history of the church, there was some debate on this point. Some people thought that marriage was a kind of concession to the flesh. People are weak, right? And so just put them together and hope for the best. Right? No, right? So what we're saying actually in truth of fact is that marriage is part of God's plan for human love and flourishing. That he intends the life of grace to be communicated in a family life. And that it is an actual expression of God's love for us. So why did God create? You can pause, think, okay, why did God create? It wasn't because God needed us. I don't say that to strike fearful thoughts into your heart. But he doesn't need us. Because if he did, that'd be kind of creepy, right? If God had a human-shaped hole in his heart and he was incomplete until such time as you salved his aching wounds, it's like, yikes. That's a very needy God. Stay back. Right? So God doesn't need us in the strict sense. I have a friend who, when he asked the question, why did God create? He says, because he thought we might like it. Right? Because God had a secret too good to keep. The secret of his love. And we are so many expressions of divine love because God wants to give abundant evidence to his unsurpassable life so that we can return to him and enjoy life forever with him in heaven. It's because his love brims over the chalice of his existence. And what we believe is that we are made to the image and likeness of God. We are patterned after God's own existence. So God is an intellectual being, and we are intellectual creatures, capacious for him. So our minds are made for what is universally true, and our hearts are made for what is universally good, and we will not be sated in the presence of any one particular good. So no matter how many Chick-fil-A chocolate chip cookies I eat, I will always go back for more, until such time as God gives me himself right? Even when you go and they like hand it to you and you look at the little window pane, you know, because they give them in those individual sleeves, and the window pane is slightly foggy, you're like, oh my gosh, this is fresh baked. Sweet Christmas. It's a great day. You know, like, but even still, I eat that, and 27 minutes later, I still have a further need for Chick-fil-A satisfaction, right? Because it's just that good. But God is better in the sense that He actually sates all desire, and we revel in Him in a kind of ongoing liturgical embrace in heaven, which admits of no diminution and cannot be lost. So we are made capable of God, and human love in marriage is made to express that. We are to be so many signs of God's love, His interpersonal love. So marriage is intended as holy. It's intended as sanctifying. It's intended as part of God's original plan. So God blesses married love. And if you doubt this, just look at the testimony of Scripture. Think of some of the first things that Jesus does when He begins His public ministry. What is His first miracle as recorded in the Gospel of John? John 2, verses 1 through 11. He blesses married love. The waiter comes to Him and says, the waiter comes to Him in the presence of His mother and says that they've run out of wine, which would be shameful for a newly married couple. To which Mary says, they have no wine. To which He replies, woman, what is it to me and to you? To which she replies, to those waiters and attendants, do whatever He tells you. And then He tells them to take 6 jars, between 20 and 30-gallon jars. These are big jars. 6 of them. And to fill them a lot, okay? To the brim, it says. And then the head waiter draws from it, takes it, and tastes what is not just decent wine, but choice wine in abundance. That is God's plan for married love. He blesses it with choice and superabundant wine. And what is more, Christ raises it to the dignity of a sacrament. So when we say, what do we mean by sacrament? A sacrament is a sign of a sacred thing, making men holy. This will come up in a later slide. But basically, a sacrament is a sign that actually makes the thing that it signifies to be. So like you come to a stop sign, right? And you think, interesting, I will momentarily slow my car down, right? But this is a different kind of sign. This is like a stop sign which actually stops your vehicle and makes you love it. It's crazy. Okay? So He takes marriage, which pre-exists His ministry, right? People have been getting married for some time, and He makes it such that it can actually be a sign of grace, so that when 2 people consent to live with one another in conjugal life and raise a family, that they can actually sanctify each other, which is staggering. So, to talk further about marriage, what makes a marriage? This is a kind of vexed question in recent years, just because of the way that the conversation has drifted. So I think it's helpful just to kind of bring back in focus what actually makes a marriage, right? So, consent makes a marriage. In all the sacraments, you know, there's a minister and there's a recipient. So like baptism has to be a deacon or a priest or a bishop in ordinary circumstances, but in danger of death, hey, anyone can baptize, even a pagan. For like confirmation, ordinarily it's a bishop, but sometimes at the Easter Vigil, your parish priest can do it. So there's a kind of a minister for each particular sacrament. The thing that's crazy about marriage is that it's actually the man and the wife who minister the sacrament. The priest is just there as a representative of the church to bless that bond. But it is the man and the wife who make it by consenting. So it's a kind of expression of self-donation. One of St. John Paul II's favorite things to quote was a passage from one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council. It's called Gaudium et Spes. And in the 24th paragraph, he says that man finds himself in a sincere gift of himself. Man finds himself in a sincere gift of himself. So marriage is a profoundly humanizing thing because it insists upon the importance of commitment. It makes us do what would be otherwise terrible, except we can now countenance it because we're doing it with our best friend. Because when you make a vow, you say, I don't really know what's going to happen over the course of the next 40, 50, 60 years, right? You could be wildly successful. You could be like a kind of rank failure. You know, like you could preserve your health, or you could be very, very sick very, very soon. I do not know what will happen. I do not know anything about the concrete circumstances of our lives, my life, your life. What I do know is that I will be next to you, and you will be next to me. And that's enough. And so sure, it's rash to make a vow. It's rash to make a commitment with yourself where you promise to show up 40 years later come hell or high water. But it's in so doing that man finds himself. So then, what am I consenting to? What is one consenting to in the offer of marriage? Well, here, again, helpful to clarify, given contemporary difficulties and the revisionist understanding. Because of the things that have gone on, I mean, just in the last 15 years, stress has been placed on the friendship dimension, the strongly felt emotional attachment. Some people, like op-ed columnists, will say things that are kind of crass, like marriage is just cohabitation, right? Marriage is just strongly felt emotional needs met with another person. But when you have that, you don't necessarily have Christian marriage. Because I have to consent to, in Christian marriage, a bond that is faithful, a bond that is fruitful, and a bond that is permanent. Faithful, that is to say, exclusive. So just this person for the rest of my life, regardless of how much our bodies change, regardless of the elasticity of our facial muscles, right? I will just be with this person. Fruitful, it's 4 children. It's 4 children, open to life, and then permanent until death do us part. So let's just take these in turn. Okay, marriage is faithful. It is exclusive. That's a kind of terrifying prospect, right? Sometimes people say hey, you're a priest. That's crazy. You gave up marriage and children. I'm I know, right? And then I'm you're married. That's crazy. You gave up marriage and children except for with one person, I just went one further. So it's a kind of terrifying thing, right? But we draw strength to make that commitment because God himself is faithful. We draw grace from its wellspring, from its source. So God, throughout the scriptures, shows himself abundantly faithful. That is, if you were to read the Old Testament as just a story of God's fidelity, it would be a sufficient read. Because God offers covenants time and time again. He offers to Adam. He offers to Noah. That's just in the first 11 chapters of the Bible. And then in Genesis 12, and then in Genesis 15, and then in Genesis 17, and then in Genesis 20, and then in Genesis 22, and then in Genesis 28, and I'm running out of breath, but I could go on. He keeps offering covenants. He promises land. He promises descendants. He promises blessing. And what is most mind-boggling about his offer of covenant is that though we be faithless, yet he is faithful, because he cannot deny himself. His very identity is that of a covenant God, a faithful God. And so he continues to give us abundance of life despite many transgressions. It's fascinating too. He often puts this in terms of marriage. He identifies himself as a kind of bridegroom God who intends to send in the last age a bridegroom Messiah. So whenever the prophets talk about the many sins of Israel, whether it's the sin of idolatry, or the sin of neglecting the poor and the destitute, or the sin of murder, or whatever it is, it's often referred to in the prophets as adultery. Because they have played the harlot. They have been unfaithful to their God who espoused them at the foot of Mount Sinai. So, what we try to enact in marriage is a reflection of God's fidelity. And the thing is, he actually empowers us through the sacrament to do just that. So perhaps you've come across the passage in Ephesians 5, 21 through 33, where it begins, be subordinate to each other out of reverence for Christ. I have a Dominican friar friend who calls this Nudge Sunday, right? Because after that line, it continues, wives, be subordinate to your husbands. And then you see in the congregation a bunch of men go. But the text goes on, right? So wives are to be subordinate to their husbands, as the church is to Christ. But husbands are supposed to love their wives after the manner of Christ's love for the church. And he laid down his life for the church. So, if a man would tell his wife, be subordinate to me out of reverence for Christ, she may just as well respond with, lay down your life, honey. Lay down your life. Right? So, the pattern of fidelity has been set for us in Christ. Because Christ is the bridegroom Messiah. He's identified as such in the scriptures. You think about it. There's actually this passage where the disciples of John the Baptist come up to Jesus and they say, Chief, what's going on here? We fast, the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but yours don't. What's the deal? And he says, it is not fitting that the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them. But there will come a time when the bridegroom is taken from them, and at that time they will fast. But here's the thing. It's kind of typical in Jewish marital ceremonies that in anticipation of the marriage, the groomsmen would effectively dispense with the customary fast of the Jewish law so as to celebrate with their friend. And then once he got married, they would observe a kind of time of mourning, and they'd take upon themselves those fasts to a greater degree. But what's crazy is that Christ doesn't get married. So what's he referring to? Well, that point at which he espouses the church, namely on the cross. Because on the cross, he consents to her and she consents to him in such a way that it is actually fashioned from his side, from water and blood, from everything poured out for love of her. So, the pattern now of married love is that set for us by Christ. It is a high standard, but he actually gives us the wherewithal, his own divine life, to carry it off. So, that's the first. The second, marriage is fruitful, which is to say that marriage is for children. Sometimes you hear marriage spoken about as having two ends, okay? The mutual support of the spouses and the procreation and education of children. Now, it can be confusing to speak of something as having two ends, because I don't know if you've ever tried to drive to Indianapolis and Nashville at the same time, but it's kind of difficult. You get to I-65 and then your car tears in half, and then you're driving like a half chassis. Okay, so getting to two ends simultaneously is difficult, but here the church intends these two ends to be understood as ordered, right? As actually coordinated in a very delicate way. So we can perhaps more fruitfully speak of it as the essence of marriage is the mutual support of the spouses. It's like the very nature of marriage, what makes it to be such, what constitutes it as a marriage. And then the goal of marriage is the procreation and education of children. Why do man and woman come together in the garden? Whenever the fathers of the church read those passages, they say it is principally as a helpmate in the work of procreation, in conjugal life, raising a family, the very reason for which man and woman come together. So, conjugal love is for marriage. Conjugal love is intended in marriage. You can think about it this way too, basically most every biological thing you can do on your own, with a notable exception, beget new life. So there's a kind of subtlety and delicacy in the Lord's plan such that in bringing about new life, it is, in the ordinary course, the fruit of the love of two persons, so that a life is begotten in a communion of love. And marriage is such that the love which begot that person is then there in 9 months to welcome him or her into the world. It's just masterful in its simplicity. So the love that begets is the love that welcomes. And so this is then where the church kind of explains her stance on contraception. So basically, in acts of married love, the unitive dimension, which is to say the coming together of a man and wife in sexual intercourse, and the procreative dimension, that is to say the openness to life, should always be present. They should always be present, because that's God's original intention for marriage. And by contracepting, you kind of block that procreative dimension. And the problem with that is that it ends up actually corrupting the love of man and woman. So it's not that the church exists for the promulgation of difficult rules so that way she can have the high ground when finger wagging. No, nor is Jesus perched on his cloud with hands crossed over his breast looking for the slightest moral fault so that way he can smite you. No, this is actually for the good of those involved. Because effectively, by contraception, one says, I take you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, except in the event of unplanned pregnancy. I take you except as capable of begetting a life, which is actually that most profound and significant dimension of one as father or mother. So by contracepting, you're actually holding back something of your love in such a way that it actually undermines the friendship of the spouses. So St. John Paul II talks about in the Theology of the Body about the language of the body. Marriage has this sense in which it's wholly donative, right? So man finds himself in the sincere gift of himself. But by contraception, you're no longer telling the truth with your body, you're telling a lie. So you're engaging in an act of sexual intercourse, which is supposed to be giving. But in truth of fact, something is being held back in a way that's insincere. So, third and final, marriage is permanent. So we said that marriage is faithful, that is to say exclusive. It is fruitful, that is to say it's intended for children. And it is permanent, that is to say until death. So, good news, God gives you the strength to carry it out. So we said that marriage is solidified by this sacramental bond. Christ takes the natural institution of marriage and raises it to the dignity of a sacrament. So now it is a sign of a sacred thing making men holy. That's St. Augustine's definition. The definition that occurs in the Catechism is that it's a visible sign of an invisible grace instituted by Christ for the church. All right? So, marriage, by virtue of Christ's choice, by virtue of the fact that he pours himself into the very consent of man and woman, is now a sign of God's love and grace for the spouses and for the family. So this, we're just going to pause for a second. This is huge, okay? So like, men and women have kind of affectionate ways of speaking about their spouses as like their cross, or their ball and chain, or like whatever, you know? Okay, I'm just not going to further elaborate because whatever. Okay, you get it. So, sometimes we speak in a language as if, you know, you make it through life in spite of this dread enemy who happens to occupy the same home as you. You know, like, I would have spent my years in kind of serene existence with a Bud Light and a beer koozie, like kind of perched on my paunch as I reclined in an easy chair and pet my Labrador Retriever watching the Ravens play football. But then I got married, and now I'm forced to empty the dishwasher. You know, it's like, sometimes we can speak about it in a kind of like, you know, rough way. But the thing that's revolutionary about the fact that marriage is a sacrament is that you actually make each other holy by virtue of your consent. So you become a sign unto your spouse of God's faithful love. That isn't just like a, hey, isn't God faithful? But it's actually like God's fidelity is worked through you unto them. So like, when you receive Holy Communion in a worthy state, it makes you more deeply part of the mystical body. When you carry out your marriage vows in a worthy state, it makes you more and more assimilated to God's love and fidelity. It makes you more and more grace-filled. It makes you more and more a saint. So that way you are not saved in spite of your spouse. You are saved precisely in and through your spouse, which is mind-boggling. There's actually like somebody who sleeps on the other side of like a queen-size bed, whose sole task in life is to get you to heaven. And so too yours for them. And then when you get children, now you've got other people to bring with you. It's like, let's go, baby. Get in the minivan, we're going to heaven. Okay. So this is why the church clarifies her position regarding divorce. So why is it that divorce is ruled out? Well, because it falsifies the sign of God's love. Because God does not divorce his people. That's the precise reason why. Because vows don't mean anything if they can be despaired of, if they can be transgressed. Now, mind you, there are some situations where the church says, yes, a husband and wife can separate. If there's a kind of grave peril to the wife or to the husband or to the children, whether by like violence or by abuse of some sort, etc. So there are reasons for which one needs separate. But the marriage perdures. So like annulments, for instance, are not just Catholic divorces. What a declaration of nullity says is this bond was never in existence. There was never a marriage here, either because you didn't observe Catholic form or you didn't intend what the church intends in marriage. But there's no divorce. There's no divorce to be spoken of. The thing that's mind-blowing is that the things that actually undermine marriage make sense in light of what I've just said. The two most significant causes of divorce in the United States are infidelity and addiction. And the principal addiction is with respect to, just because there are children present here, things that one might see on the internet, right? And that's a kind of infidelity of sorts. So it's significant that infidelity is what actually undermines fidelity, because you're actually falsifying the sign of God's love, which is faithful to the end. Okay, so we started with the beginning, which Christ clarified for us, but the great news is that he also clarifies the end. So this is taken from Matthew 22. The same day, the Sadducees came to him who say that there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses said if a man dies, having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up children for his brother." Okay, so this is a kind of wild example, but let's go for it. Now, there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no children, left his wife to his brother. So to the second and the third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, to which of the 7 will she be wife? For they all had her. So the Sadducees here don't believe in the resurrection, so they're trying to pose a stumper to Jesus. At the end of Matthew, in chapter 22, Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, all of them are trying to stump Jesus, and all of them fail. You can't, okay? He's unstumpable. He's just that good, all right? So they've posed this question because they want to say, marriage can only obtain between 2 persons, so to whom will she be married in the resurrection, right? So he says, but Jesus answered them, you are wrong because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Now, for some married persons, I know, some people have testified to this. This is a kind of fearful thought. Like if you die, you like come to the pearly gates, and Peter's there, with like a tablet, and he's kind of swiping through. He's like, wives over here, husbands over there, and never the twain shall meet. It's like, whoa, okay? Like, it seems incongruous that the person with whom you spent most of your life, with whom you had the most meaningful friendship, with whom you shared everything most important to you, would then be like alienated from you in heaven? Is that what Jesus is saying? By the tone of my voice, you have inferred that it is not, okay? So that's not what Jesus is saying. So what is he describing? Well, marriage passes away in heaven. Marriage passes away in heaven. Why? Because marriage is a sign. And in heaven, there will be no need for signs. There will only be realities. Faith will pass away in heaven because faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. But faith gives way to vision. But because you no longer need assurance, you no longer need evidence when you behold the Word incarnate. So too hope will pass away. Hope is a kind of confident trust that God will give you eternal life because He is merciful and He is omnipotent. But when you possess Him, you need no longer hope for Him. So too, the sacraments are signs of grace, but you do not need signs of grace when you swim in it. For in the end, they will neither be married nor given in marriage, for all of us will be wed directly to God Himself. Will we know our spouses in heaven? Yes. But there will be no veil of mediation. There will only be the immediacy of God's love. And the love which existed here will perdure in heaven, only purified, healed, strengthened, and emboldened. So, that's God's plan for your love. And at this point, I'm delighted to answer any of your questions.
So thank you for your presentation, Father. Really laid out the beautiful vision of marriage very clearly. So you talked about, thank you, the troubling times that the Christian view of marriage in particular has experienced. In the time that we're living in, we can see it most particularly, but it's been assaulted somewhere or another throughout all of history. So how do we, who are trying to live out this vision, kind of witness it and bring it out to the world that either doesn't know how to receive this type of vision, or doesn't, or just rejects it outright? How do we speak to a culture that all this is very foreign?
Right. So I would answer that perhaps in a couple of parts. Mother Teresa is quoted as having saying, if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. Which doesn't sound like the missionary impulse which led her to found one of the most significant religious congregations of the 20th century. But you can see a kind of wisdom in it. Because evangelization starts at home, which is part of like the beauty of this program, namely that you're like the whole family is catechized together. Because I've done a lot of studies actually that like when you break people up into age groups, it often tends to be less than helpful. So if the model of catechesis is such that the whole family is not present, then people tend to associate the faith with a particular time in their life or particular relationships with friends, but it doesn't necessarily perdure when you have significant changes, like when you go to college or when you graduate. So to do it as a family is the most significant witness, because you think about the kind of order of charity. So St. Augustine talked about the order of charity. There are people for whom we are more responsible. So you're more responsible for yourself, for your own sanctification, than for that of others. And as a husband and father, you're more responsible for the sanctification of your wife and children than you are for others. So I think there's a real gravity to that claim, that sometimes a kind of missionary urgency can lead us to forget what is most essential. So I don't think we need to feel guilty for spending quality time at home. Sometimes there's a kind of sense that because everything is so crazy out there, I need to fix all of it yesterday. But truth be told, souls are won one by one. They are won one by one, as each is incorporated personally into Jesus Christ. And that is painstaking, and it is difficult, and it is arduous, but it's worthy, because the very process itself is sanctifying. And it actually comes to fruition in this really deep friendship which abides unto heaven. So I would say, maybe contrary to what may be anticipated, to start at home. And I think that praying as a family is the most significant way to do that. My parents were really devious in the way that they did this, so it was awesome, actually. My father just wanted to say a rosary every night, and he's not one to be trifled with in that regard. But my mother wanted to talk to us and snuggle with us every night. Okay, it's hard to talk, snuggle, and pray simultaneously, but they figured a way, okay? So what would happen is Dad would be like, rosary time, and then all the kids would be like, why? Or no, or I'd rather not. And then he'd be like, yeah, that's cute, come here. And then we'd get there in the living room, and we'd all assume our prayer postures. So somebody would be laying on the couch, somebody would be splayed on the floor, somebody would be trying to tiptoe away. And then my mother would be like, hey, what are your intentions? What does everyone want to pray for? And then we'd start chiming in. And so my one sister would be like, for this particular friend, Kimberly, who was just diagnosed with leukemia. And it's like, wow, that's really significant. And so my mother would be like, what's that been like in your class? And all of a sudden, my parents are having really significant conversations with all of their kids at the same time, which is pretty smart. I don't know if they intended it that way, but kudos to them if they did. So it ended up that intentions sometimes would last 30 minutes. And we're having quality conversation about the most significant issues, such that my parents really know what's going on in our lives, what we care about, and what we love. And in that, we are formed as a family. Such that now, my brothers and sisters all practice the faith. It's all part of their lives. They're all involved in their, ecclesial life and marriage prep and this, that, or the other. Not that necessarily it's a standard of sanctity, but they love their faith, and they're energized about it. So I think the way that you can best disciple the world is to disciple your home. And I think I might just leave it at that.
Hi, I was just wondering how the church views marriages that were not blessed by the church.
Right. So the question regards marriages that were not blessed by the church. So first step, what does it mean to have your marriage blessed by the church? Typically, if one of the parties involved in contracting a marriage is a baptized Catholic, then you are bound by canon law, which demands that a Catholic observe Catholic form. What is Catholic form? It means to have a Catholic service, either a mass or a ceremony. There be a priest there, or a deacon, and that there be 2 witnesses. So if you were to not have this, you would need to obtain permission from your pastor, who gets it from the diocese, for you to do some other type of service, but that permission is rarely granted. So for those Catholics, or those who marry Catholics, then in not a church service and not a Catholic service, they are not recognized as having been married in the church. So there are ways to go about rectifying that situation. And the shortest possible answer is talk to the pastor, because they're so different and varied that sometimes it's unhelpful to describe the exact cases and how they're dealt with. But basically, the good news is that there's typically a way forward, right? So sometimes people despair of it as a possibility, and then they just resign themselves to not receiving the sacraments for many years, which is sad. But it often begins with a simple conversation with a priest, and then you're able to find a way through. So if there have been prior bonds, so if this represents a second or a third marriage, then there are further complications, but that does not necessarily preclude the possibility of the marriage being blessed. So there are ways of going about it also that are secret, in the sense of not public. So if you've been living together with your spouse in a bond that hasn't been blessed for many years, it would be embarrassing to have like a Catholic wedding. People would be like, what's going on here? So it's something that you can do with your parish priest at like 7:45 in the morning on a Saturday. I've done it before, right? And it's just like, you know, like there were two witnesses there. It's like the altar server and then a guy who's a great guy who brought candy. Right, so the short answer is the marriage needs to be contracted according to canon law, which means presence of a minister and two witnesses. If it hasn't been, then it can ordinarily be rectified. That just means having a conversation with the pastor. So the question is regarding, I said to the effect of, if it doesn't help you get into heaven, it's so much nonsense. Now, behind that, there's a theology of charity. So the principle of, okay, so we want to enjoy life in heaven. How do you get into heaven? By basically living heaven now. Right, so heaven is not just delayed gratification. It's the coming to fruition of a life that has been lived towards heaven for the entirety of one's days. So C.S. Lewis says, when you die, regardless of where you end up, you will look back on your days on earth and you will recognize them. He says, for those who end in hell, they will look back on their life and recognize it as hell on earth. And for those who end in heaven, they will look back on their days and recognize it as having been heaven on earth. So what's the principle of our enjoyment of heaven? What helps us to enter into the fullness thereof? It's charity. It's charity. It's love. Because God gives us, by grace, His own divine love, whereby we can love Him and love our neighbor in such a way that we can actually live a supernatural life. So one that transcends the bounds of our limited nature in such a way that we can grow ever more deeply, ever more kind of like widely in that abiding grace. And there is nothing from that perspective that is neutral. So like Saint Therese of Lisieux is famous for having said that we are called to do little things, small things, with great love. Because love can be brought to bear on all of our tasks. So I don't mean to say that like, if taking out the trash doesn't help you get to heaven, then you shouldn't do it. Because that can be done in a spirit of obedience, or it can be done in a spirit of service to your family. It can be done in a spirit of virtue, which is actually meritorious, which actually speeds your steps along the path towards life, life eternal. But there are some things which detract from that. There are things which have us veer aside. There are things which have us abandon it. And those are the things that are so much nonsense. So when I say if it doesn't help you get to heaven, I mean if it is a kind of unnecessary burden that is not grace-bearing, if it is the kind of thing which is not actually blessed by Christ, not actually instituted by the church, something of our own imagining, a kind of idol or a kind of vain musing, then those are the things to be discarded. Yeah. A concrete example. Sometimes we think that God loves us because we're great. He doesn't. God loves us because because He is good, not because we are good. Which is, on the one hand, shocking, but on the other hand, supremely freeing. So God doesn't love you because you're handsome or pretty. He doesn't love you because you're talented. He doesn't love you because you're smart. He doesn't love you because you're successful at your job. I'm not saying that He doesn't care about those things, but I'm saying that He loves you because He loves you. Where God found not love, He put love there. And thence you came to exist. So God is the protagonist of the saving work in a way that really goes beyond what we can envision. If we knew, if we believed in the love God has for us, if we trusted in it, that would revolutionize our lives. And gradually we grow into that, and that's just the life of sanctification. But concretely to that point, that's what matters.